Gunfire doesn't sound like it does in the movies. It doesn't pop. It shatters. It sucks the oxygen right out of your lungs. 1 second, Tess was pouring cheap, lukewarm filter coffee into a chipped ceramic mug. The next, the diner's front window exploded into 1,000 jagged teeth. She didn't think. She just grabbed the frail old man sitting at the counter and dragged him down into the grease-stained dirt of the floor. That single breathless decision changed everything. The neon sign outside Frankie's diner buzzed with a dying, erratic rhythm. It blinked red through the relentless November rain, casting a bloody hue over the wet asphalt of 4th Street. Inside it smelled of burnt bacon-fat old bleach and the damp wool of cheap coats. Tess leaned against the back counter, her feet throbbing. She was 24, but the harsh, fluorescent lighting and double shifts made her feel a decade older. She rubbed the back of her neck, her fingers grazing the tight, messy bun she'd tied her hair into 10 hours ago. 2 more hours. 2 more hours, and she could take the night bus back to her cramped apartment, where the radiator clanked loudly enough to mask the sounds of the sirens outside. The diner was mostly empty. A long-haul trucker was asleep in a corner booth, his face buried in his folded arms. And then there was Leo. Tess didn't know his last name. He was just Leo. He came in every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 11 at night. He wore a heavy frayed tweed coat that looked like it had been expensive 30 years ago, and a flat cap pulled low over his liver-spotted forehead. He always sat on the 3rd stool from the left, ordered a black coffee, and nursed it until it went ice-cold. He rarely spoke, but he always left 3 crumpled dollar bills under his saucer. Tonight his hands were shaking worse than usual as he lifted the mug. "You want me to warm that up for you, Leo?" Tess asked, keeping her voice low. The silence in the diner was heavy, and she didn't want to break it. The old man looked up. His eyes were a pale, cloudy blue, rimmed with red. He looked tired. Not just sleepy, but bone-weary, the kind of tired that seeped into the marrow. "No, thank you, my dear." He rasped, his voice thick with gravel and a faint, unplaceable accent. "It is fine, just the way it is." Tess nodded, grabbing a rag to wipe down the already clean laminate counter. She heard the squeal of tires before she saw the car. It was a sharp, violent sound that cut through the steady hum of the rain. Tires hydroplaning, braking hard against the curb right outside the diner's front doors. Tess looked up. A black SUV idled violently at the curb. The back doors flew open. 2 men stepped onto the sidewalk. They wore dark clothes and heavy boots, but it was their faces that made Tess's stomach drop into her shoes. Black ski masks, and in their hands long dark shapes that caught the red glow of the neon sign. Everything slowed down. The ticking of the clock above the kitchen doors seemed to stretch into eternity. The first man raised a shotgun. He didn't even bother coming inside. He just aimed it straight through the plate glass window, right at the 3rd stool from the left. Tess didn't make a conscious choice. There was no heroic internal monologue. There was only raw animal panic. She lunged over the counter. Her ribs slammed against the hard edge, knocking the wind out of her, but she kept her momentum. She grabbed a fistful of Leo's heavy tweed coat and yanked backward with every ounce of strength she possessed in her tired, aching frame. The world erupted. The sound was deafening. It was a physical force that punched her in the chest. The massive plate glass window didn't just break, it atomized. A wave of glass shards, cold rain, and splintered wood washed over the diner. Tess hit the floor hard, her shoulder taking the brunt of the impact against the cracked linoleum. She dragged Leo down with her, shielding his frail body with her own. Boom! A second shot tore through the diner. The ceramic coffee mugs on the back shelf shattered raining hot liquid and razor-sharp shrapnel down onto Tess's back. She squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face into the collar of Leo's coat, tasting dust and sulfur. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick with the acrid smoke of gunpowder and pulverized plaster. Boom! The cash register exploded, sending coins pinging wildly across the room like shrapnel, and then silence. The ringing in Tess's ears was high and sharp. Beneath it she could hear the frantic squeal of tires as the SUV peeled away into the night, the engine roaring until it faded into the distance. Tess didn't move. She couldn't. Her hands were clamped onto Leo's coat so tightly her knuckles were white. She waited for the pain. She waited to feel a hole in her back, waiting for the warm rush of blood. "Girl!" a voice croaked beneath her. Tess gasped, her eyes snapping open. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, wincing as glass crunched beneath her forearms. Leo was looking up at her. His hat had fallen off, revealing a sparse crown of white hair. He was covered in dust, but there was no blood. His cloudy blue eyes were entirely clear and piercing and completely devoid of panic. It was an unsettling look for an old man who had just been shot at. "Are you hit?" he asked, his voice steady. Tess patted herself down frantically. Her hands were shaking violently. I don't think so. Oh my God. "Breathe," Leo commanded softly. It wasn't a request. It was an order, spoken by a man used to being obeyed. Sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the ringing in her ears. Leo pushed himself up into a sitting position, brushing a pile of shattered glass off his lap with nonchalance. He looked at the ruined diner, then at Tess. He reached out his trembling hand, touching her cheek, wiping away a smear of soot. "You shouldn't have done that, Tess," he murmured, reading her name tag. "But I will not forget it." Before the police cars even rounded the corner, their red and blue lights spinning frantically across the wet brick of the buildings opposite, the old man was gone. He slipped out the back door by the kitchens, vanishing into the alleyway, like a ghost, leaving Tess kneeling in the ruins, trembling amidst the smell of spilled coffee and spent buckshot. Tess didn't sleep. She spent the night sitting on the edge of her lumpy mattress, wrapped in a faded quilt, staring blindly at the water stain on her ceiling. Every time she closed her eyes, the window exploded all over again. She felt the impact. She tasted the sulfur. The police had kept her at the diner for 3 hours. They asked the same questions over and over. Did she know the shooters? Did she see their faces? Who was the old man? She told them the truth. She saw masks. She saw shotguns. The old man was just a regular who tipped in quarters. The detectives had looked at each other with tired, cynical eyes, scribbled in their notebooks, and told her to go home. They treated it like a random act of gang violence, a tragic symptom of a decaying city. By 6 a.m., the cold grey light of morning crept through her thin blinds. Tess got up. Her body ached, as if she'd been beaten with a bat. Her shoulder was heavily bruised, a dark purple shadow blooming across her pale skin. She walked to the bathroom, splashed freezing water on her face, and looked in the mirror. She looked like hell. Dark bags hung under her eyes. But underneath the exhaustion, a cold, hard knot of anxiety was forming in her stomach. Frankie's diner was ruined. That meant it was closed, which meant she had no shift today, which meant she wouldn't make tips. She had $52 in her checking account, and rent was due in 4 days. The gunfire hadn't killed her, but the aftermath just might starve her. She put on her uniform anyway, a clean, albeit faded blue dress and white apron, and grabbed her heavy coat. She needed to see if Carl, the sweaty, perpetually stressed manager, was going to pay her for the hours she'd worked last night. The rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and freezing. When Tess turned the corner onto 4th Street, she froze. She expected police tape. She expected the street to be empty. Instead, Frankie's was bustling. The shattered front window had been boarded up with thick plywood, smelling fresh and raw in the damp air. The neon sign was off, but the interior lights were blazing. Tess pushed open the heavy glass door, the familiar bell ringing above her head. The smell of bleach was overpowering, masking the lingering scent of gunpowder. Carl was behind the counter, sweating profusely furiously, wiping down the pie case. "Carl," Tess asked, stepping inside tentatively. "You're open?" Carl jumped his eyes wide. He looked like he was vibrating on a terrifying amount of caffeine. "Tess, yeah, we're open. Get an apron on. We got a full house." Tess looked around the diner. It was indeed full, but it wasn't the usual morning crowd of tired nurses and hungover college students. The diner was occupied by men in suits. There were 4 of them. They sat in 2 separate booths near the front door flanking the entrance. They weren't wearing cheap department store suits either. These were tailored dark wool, immaculate and sharp. They looked entirely out of place against the cracked vinyl booths and sticky tables. They weren't eating. They all had a cup of black coffee in front of them, steam rising in a thin, undisturbed column. They were perfectly still, their eyes sweeping the room, tracking every movement on the street outside the glass door. Tess felt the hairs on her arms stand up. The way their jackets draped over their chests, there was bulk there. Unnatural bulk. Guns. She walked slowly behind the counter, grabbing a fresh apron. "Carl," she hissed, grabbing his sleeve. "Who are those guys? Are they cops?" Carl wouldn't look at her. He kept scrubbing the clean glass. "Don't ask questions, Tess. Just pour the coffee. Don't look 'em in the eye. Don't drop anything. Just survive the shift." Tess swallowed hard. She walked out from behind the counter, grabbing a fresh pot of coffee. Her hands betrayed her trembling slightly as she approached the first booth. 2 men sat there. One was older, with a thick scar cutting through his left eyebrow. The other was younger, with cold, dead eyes. "More coffee?" Tess asked. Her voice cracked. She hated how weak she sounded. She was a city girl. She was used to tough guys. But these men didn't project toughness. They projected casual, professional violence. The older man looked up at her. His gaze flicked to her name tag. Tess. His expression softened by a microscopic fraction. "No thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice surprisingly polite. "We're just waiting for someone." Tess nodded quickly, retreating to the safety of the counter. She spent the next 2 hours cleaning things that were already clean, trying to ignore the heavy, suffocating presence of the 4 men. No other customers came in. Anyone who walked past the diner, took one look through the door, saw the men in the suits, and kept walking. At exactly 9 a.m., a black Lincoln Navigator glided to a halt in front of the diner. The 4 men in the booths sat up a little straighter. They didn't move to stand, but the atmosphere in the room shifted. It grew tighter, denser. The back door of the Lincoln opened. A man stepped out onto the wet pavement. He didn't look like the others. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore dark jeans, heavy leather boots, and a charcoal grey cashmere overcoat left unbuttoned over a black turtleneck. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a terrifying grace. As he walked toward the door, Tess caught a glimpse of his face. He was young, maybe early 30s, but he looked ancient. His jaw was covered in dark stubble, and his eyes were a deep, impenetrable brown. There was a hard, cynical set to his mouth, a man who had seen the ugliest parts of the world and learned how to rule them. The bell chimed. He stepped inside. All 4 men in the booths stood up instantly. Total, silent respect. The man didn't look at them. He didn't look at Carl, who looked ready to faint behind the register. His dark eyes swept the room and locked onto Tess. He walked straight toward the counter. Every step was deliberate. He sat on the 3rd stool from the left, the exact stool the old man had been sitting on last night. He placed his large, scarred hands on the laminate counter. He looked at Tess, his gaze heavy and piercing. "Black coffee," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that sent a strange shiver down Tess's spine. "Please." Tess didn't move for a full 3 seconds. Her brain was screaming at her to run out the back door, to keep running until she was in another state. But poverty breeds a stubborn kind of paralysis. She needed this job. With jerky mechanical movements, she grabbed a mug, placed it in front of him, and filled it with black coffee. A few drops spilled onto the counter. She quickly grabbed a rag and wiped it away, avoiding his eyes. "You're Tess," the man said. It wasn't a question. Tess took a step back, folding her arms tight across her chest, a defensive barrier. "Yeah. Who are you? And why are your friends scaring off my customers?" She shocked herself with the bite in her tone. But exhaustion was starting to overwrite her fear, replacing it with a cynical annoyance. She was tired of being scared. She was tired of being broke. And she was tired of rich men in nice coats thinking they owned the room. The man didn't blink at her hostility. He simply lifted the mug and took a sip of the bitter coffee. He didn't flinch at the heat. "My name is Gabriel," he said quietly. "Gabriel Rossi. The men by the door aren't my friends. They're my employees. And they're here to make sure no one comes through that door to finish the job they started last night." Tess felt the blood drain from her face. Rossi. She didn't read the papers much, but you didn't live in this city without knowing that name. The Rossi family owned the docks, half the unions, and the politicians who pretended they didn't. The old man, Tess whispered the realization, hitting her like a physical blow. "Leo. His name is Leonardo Rossi," Gabriel corrected softly. "He is my grandfather. He built our family. And for the last 2 years, he's been losing a war against his own mind. Dementia." Gabriel looked down at his coffee. For a brief, fleeting second, the terrifying mob boss vanished, replaced by a tired grandson. "He slips away sometimes. The guards I pay to watch him get complacent. He reverts to old habits. 30 years ago, this diner was a front for a bookie. He used to come here to collect. In his mind, it's still 1995. He thinks he's just doing his rounds." Tess stared at him. He was just a confused old man. A confused old man whose head has a $2 million bounty on it, Gabriel said, his voice hardening, the vulnerability gone as quickly as it appeared. "The Maroney family found out he was wandering without a detail. They sent 2 hitters to put him in the ground and send a message to me." Gabriel looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The intensity in them was almost suffocating. "They failed. Because of you." Tess swallowed hard, her throat bone dry. "I didn't know who he was. I saw the guns. He was in the way. I pulled him down. It was reflex." "Reflex," Gabriel repeated, tasting the word. He reached into the inside pocket of his cashmere coat. Tess flinched, stepping back, expecting a weapon. Instead, Gabriel pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope and slid it across the counter. It stopped right in front of her. It was heavy, bulging. "There is $50,000 in that envelope," Gabriel said smoothly. "Tax-free, untraceable." Tess stared at the brown paper. $50,000. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life. It was rent for 5 years. It was a new car. It was freedom from the clanking radiator and the aching feet. But looking at the envelope, she didn't feel relief. She felt a cold, creeping dread. Money from men like Gabriel Rossi didn't come without strings. It was a leash. It was blood money. "No," Tess said. Gabriel's hand hovered over the envelope. He frowned, a slight crease appearing between his dark brows. It was clear he was rarely told no. "Excuse me, I said no." Tess pushed the envelope back across the counter with a single finger, as if it were infected. "I don't want your money, Mr. Rossi." Gabriel stared at her, genuinely perplexed. "Are you insulted by the amount? Because we can negotiate." "I'm not negotiating." Tess snapped, her voice rising slightly. The 4 men in the booths shifted their heads, turning toward the counter. Gabriel held up a single hand without looking back, and the men settled instantly. Tess took a shaky breath, trying to lower her heart rate. "Look, I don't care who you are. I don't care who your grandfather is. I pulled an old man to the ground so he wouldn't get his head blown off. I'd do it for anyone. I didn't do it for a payout. I owe you a life debt, Tess," Gabriel said, leaning forward. His voice was a low rumble. "In my world, a debt unpaid is a weakness. You saved my blood. I take care of the people who take care of mine." "Well, in my world, people work for their money," Tess shot back, leaning her hands on the counter, matching his posture. "I don't want a debt from the mob. I don't want a target on my back. I want to pour bad coffee, collect my meager tips, and go home to my crappy apartment in peace. So take your envelope, take your tailored goons, and get out of my diner." Silence stretched between them. It was thick, heavy, and dangerous. Carl whimpered softly from the kitchen doorway. Gabriel looked at her. Really looked at her. He took in the faded uniform, the bruised shoulder peeking out from her collar, the exhausted bags under her eyes, and the fierce, unbroken pride radiating from her small frame. Slowly the corner of his mouth twitched upward. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was an acknowledgement. He picked up the envelope and slipped it back into his coat. "You're a proud woman, Tess Morgan." "I'm a tired woman," she corrected him flatly. Gabriel stood up. He buttoned his coat. "Very well. Keep your peace." He threw $100 bill onto the counter. "For the coffee." He turned and walked toward the door. Tess let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Her legs felt weak. It was over, but as Gabriel reached the door, he stopped. He looked back over his shoulder. "But my men stay," Gabriel stated. "What, no?" Tess protested, stepping around the counter. "You can't do that. You'll ruin business." "The Maronis know you saved him," Gabriel said, his voice stripped of all warmth, leaving only cold, pragmatic reality. "They saw your face. In their eyes you took a side. They will come back, and they won't just aim for the old man this time." He opened the door, letting the cold, damp air rush into the diner. "They stay," Gabriel repeated, looking her dead in the eye. "Until I know you're safe. Whether you like it or not." The door swung shut. The bell chimed. Gabriel got into the Lincoln and it drove away. Tess stood in the middle of the diner. She looked at the four men in the booths. They looked back at her, their expressions entirely blank. She was safe, and she was completely, utterly trapped. By day 3, the diner smelled less like burnt coffee and more like expensive cologne and gun oil. Tess wiped down the counter for the 12th time in an hour. The laminate was stripped dull from the bleach. She kept her eyes down, but she could feel the weight of their presence. The four men in suits had settled into a grim, unyielding routine. They rotated shifts 2 at a time, but the effect was identical. They sat in the front booths. They drank black coffee. They watched the street. The younger one, a heavy-set man with a broken nose, who introduced himself only as Dominic, spent his time methodically filling out crossword puzzles in pen. The older man with the scarred eyebrow, Victor, just stared out the reinforced plywood window patch, as motionless as a gargoyle. They were polite. They never harassed her. They always left a $5 bill for a $2 coffee. But their politeness didn't pay her rent. The regulars had vanished. The trucker who usually slept in the corner booth took one look through the glass on Wednesday morning, saw Victor's dead-eyed stare, and kept walking. The local nurses stopped coming in for their graveyard shift breakfast. By Thursday afternoon, the diner was practically a ghost town. Tess's tip jar contained exactly 4 crumpled dollar bills and a handful of dull pennies. She did the math in her head, while she blindly scrubbed the pie display case. Rent was $400. Electricity was $42. She had $52 in her checking. Her paycheck wouldn't clear until next Friday, and even then, without tips, it wouldn't cover the gap. A cold, familiar panic started to claw at the lining of her stomach. Poverty was a loud, ticking clock, and she was out of time. Tess, she jumped, nearly dropping the glass cleaner. Carl was standing at the entrance to the kitchen. He looked worse than she felt. His apron was stained with old grease, and a sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead, catching the harsh fluorescent light. He was wringing a dish towel between his thick hands. "Come in the back for a minute," he mumbled, refusing to make eye contact with her or with Dominic, who hadn't looked up from his crossword, but whose posture had immediately stiffened. Tess dried her hands on her apron and followed Carl into the cramped, windowless office. It smelled intensely of old mop water and cheap cigars. Carl shut the door, ensuring it clicked shut, before slumping into the rolling chair behind his cluttered metal desk. "Carl, if this is about the ketchup bottles, I filled them." "It's not the ketchup," Carl interrupted, his voice a strained wheeze. He rubbed his face with both hands. "I'm bleeding out here, Tess. You see the register. We've done $40 in sales today. 40. I can't afford to keep the lights on, let alone the grills." Tess felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet. "It's just a slow week. It's the rain." "It's not the rain." Carl gestured vaguely toward the front of the diner. "It's the muscle sitting in my booths. People are terrified. The whole block knows what happened the other night. They know who those guys work for. They're waiting for another drive-by, and they aren't going to buy a short stack while they wait." "Gabriel said they'd leave when it's safe," Tess said, though the words tasted hollow in her own mouth. "I don't care what Gabriel Rossi said," Carl hissed, slamming a hand on the desk, before immediately looking terrified at his own volume. He lowered his voice to a whisper. "I have a mortgage, Tess. I have kids. I can't let this place go under." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small white envelope. He slid it across the metal desk. It stopped against a stack of unpaid invoices. Tess stared at it. It wasn't bulging like Gabriel's envelope. It was thin, pathetic. "I'm sorry, kid," Carl said, looking at the floor. "I really am. You're a good worker, but they're here for you. If you go, they go. I scraped together your wages for the week, plus a little extra. Just hand in the apron." Tess didn't touch the envelope. The ticking clock in her head stopped, replaced by a deafening, hollow ringing. Fired. She was fired. Not because she was late, not because she dropped a tray, because she didn't let an old man get shot. "Carl, please," she whispered, the pride she had flashed at Gabriel completely evaporating under the crushing weight of reality. "I need this job. I have nothing else. Just give it a few more days." "I can't," Carl said, his voice hardening with the desperate selfishness of a man protecting his own. "Take the money, Tess. Go out the back door. Please." Tess looked at him for a long moment. She saw the fear in his eyes and the finality. There was no arguing with a man who thought his life was falling apart. She reached out with a trembling hand, picked up the thin envelope, and shoved it into her pocket. She untied her apron, dropping it onto the desk. It landed with a soft, defeated sigh. She walked out the back door into the alleyway. The November air was brutally cold, biting through her thin sweater. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, threatening freezing rain. She walked toward the bus stop, her boots splashing in oily puddles, her mind entirely blank. She made it exactly 1 block before a black Lincoln Navigator slid out of the traffic and pulled up neatly against the curb, blocking her path. The rear passenger window rolled down with a soft electronic hum. Gabriel Rossi sat in the back. He wasn't wearing an overcoat today, just a tailored charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders flawlessly. The muted grey interior of the luxury SUV made him look like a phantom, all sharp angles and dark, calculating eyes. "Get in," he said. Tess stopped on the wet sidewalk. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, as a gust of wind ripped down the avenue. She glared at him. Go to hell. She tried to step around the SUV, but the front passenger door opened. Victor, the older guard from the diner, stepped out. He didn't reach for his coat, didn't make a threatening move, but he stood directly in her path, an immovable wall of muscle and wool. Ms. Morgan. Victor said, his tone entirely conversational. Please. Tess looked back at Gabriel. He was watching her with an expression of mild, patient annoyance. I'm not getting in a car with you, she snapped, raising her voice over the roar of passing traffic. You've already ruined my life this week. I think we're done. You were fired, Gabriel stated flatly. 4 minutes ago. Carl called my associate the second you walked out the back door. Tess flushed hotly. The humiliation burned in her chest, replacing the cold. So you know I'm unemployed. Congratulations. Now call off your dog and let me walk home. The Maronis know where you live, Tess, Gabriel said. He didn't raise his voice, but the absolute certainty in his tone froze her to the spot. They've had a car parked at the end of your street since yesterday morning. A blue sedan. 2 men inside. Do you really think my guards were just at the diner to protect my grandfather's memory? Tess felt the breath leave her lungs. A blue sedan. She had seen it. Yesterday morning, when she took the trash out, there was a car idling by the fire hydrant. She had thought nothing of it. This was the city. Cars idled everywhere. They're waiting for you to be isolated. Gabriel continued, his dark eyes locking onto hers, stripping away her defiance. They can't hit you at the diner with my men there. They won't hit you on a crowded bus. But the walk from your bus stop to your apartment building, that alleyway by the dumpsters, you wouldn't make it to your front door. Tess's hand started to shake. The reality of it, the violent, absurd reality, was finally cracking through her stubborn shell. This wasn't a movie. Men with shotguns had tried to kill someone 3 feet away from her. Why wouldn't they kill her too? She looked at Victor. He offered a slight, grim nod. Slowly feeling like she was stepping off a cliff, Tess walked to the rear door of the Lincoln. She pulled it open and climbed inside. The heavy door shut behind her, cutting off the sounds of the city entirely. The interior was dead quiet, smelling of rich leather and the faint, crisp scent of peppermint. It was warm. Too warm. Tess felt suffocated. Gabriel tapped the partition window. The driver pulled away from the curb, sliding seamlessly back into the flow of traffic. Tess pressed herself against the opposite door, keeping as much distance between them as the spacious back seat allowed. She stared out the tinted window, watching the grim grey city slide by. Where are we going? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. To fix the problem I created, Gabriel said. He opened a small compartment built into the center console and pulled out a silver flask. He unscrewed it, took a brief sip, and offered it to her. Tess shook her head. I don't drink. Gabriel capped the flask and put it away. Carl was compensated for his loss of business. He will receive a check every month for the next year. He fired you because I told him to. Tess whipped her head around, her eyes blazing. You told him to fire me, you son of a bitch! That job was all I had. That job was a tactical nightmare. Gabriel corrected his voice, entirely devoid of emotion. He was speaking as if assessing a spreadsheet. A glass-fronted building on a busy street with 3 points of entry. Keeping you alive there required 4 men and exposed us to public scrutiny. Moving you was the only logical step. Since you refused my money and insisted on working, I removed your incentive to stay at the diner. You don't own me, Tess shouted, the sheer arrogance of his actions making her see red. You can't just dismantle my life because it's convenient for you. I am trying to keep you breathing, Gabriel said, leaning toward her. The sudden proximity killed her anger, instantly replacing it with a primal, instinctual wariness. The Maroney family is not a street gang, Tess. They are an institution. They don't forgive. They don't forget. And right now you are an unpaid debt on their ledger. They will balance it. You cannot go back to your apartment. Then where am I supposed to go? Tess asked, the desperation finally bleeding through. I have nowhere else. Gabriel sat back, watching her carefully. My grandfather requires round-the-clock care. He has nurses, but he hates them. He throws his food at them. He refuses to eat. He remembers you. He remembers that you didn't look at him with pity. He thinks you're a waitress from 1995, but he likes you. Tess frowned, confused by the sudden pivot. You want me to wait tables for your grandfather? I want you to be his caretaker, Gabriel said. You will live at the estate. You will cook his meals, ensure he takes his medication, and keep him company. The estate is fortified. The Maronis cannot touch you there. And if I say no, Gabriel didn't blink. I will give you the $50,000, drop you at the bus station, and wish you luck. I will not put my men at risk to guard a stubborn woman who refuses to survive. It was a cold, brutal calculation. He wasn't playing the White Knight. He was offering a transaction, her freedom for her life. Tess reached into her pocket. Her fingers brushed against the thin, pathetic envelope Carl had given her. It contained maybe $200. Rent, food. A blue sedan waiting at the end of the street. She looked at Gabriel's tailored suit, at the expensive leather seats. She hated him. She hated his power, his money, and the casual way he had bulldozed her entire existence. But more than that, she hated the idea of dying in a dirty alleyway over a cup of filter coffee. "What's the pay?" she asked, her voice flat, staring dead ahead at the partition. Gabriel's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Respect, maybe, or just satisfaction at winning. $3,000 a week, he said softly. Room and board included. Tess closed her eyes. It was a king's ransom. It was a gilded cage. Fine, she breathed, but I need my things. They didn't let her go up to her apartment alone. Gabriel stayed in the idling SUV reading emails on a sleek tablet, completely detached. Dominic, the crossword enthusiast, walked up the 3 flights of stairs with Tess. The hallway of her building smelled of boiled cabbage and stale cigarettes. The carpet was a mottled, unidentifiable brown stained by years of neglect. Dominic walked a step behind her, his heavy footfalls making no sound on the threadbare carpet. He moved with a practiced, terrifying silence. Tess unlocked her door, the deadbolt sticking the way it always did. She shoved it open with her hip and flipped the light switch. The bare bulb in the center of the ceiling flickered, casting harsh yellow shadows over her tiny living room. It was pathetic. A futon that doubled as a bed, a milk crate acting as a coffee table, and a small rattling refrigerator in the corner. The radiator clanged violently, hissing steam into the damp room. Dominic stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He didn't sneer. He didn't look disgusted. His eyes simply swept the room, checking the window locks, assessing the sight lines. He treated her poverty with the same professional indifference he treated the diner. "You have 10 minutes, Miss Morgan," Dominic said, quietly, standing perfectly still by the door. "Take only what you need. We'll provide everything else." Tess didn't argue. She pulled a faded canvas duffel bag from beneath the futon. She packed mechanically. 7 pairs of underwear, 5 pairs of socks, her 2 pairs of jeans, a handful of cheap sweaters, her toothbrush. She paused at the small nightstand, looking at the only photograph in the apartment. It was her and her mother, taken 10 years ago at a cheap carnival. Her mother looked tired, sick, but smiling. Tess hesitated, her thumb brushing the cheap plastic frame. Leaving it felt like severing an anchor. But the Rossi estate wasn't a home. It was a bunker. Taking a piece of her real life into that world felt dangerous. Like an infection, she left the photo face down on the nightstand. She zipped the duffel bag. It was light. 24 years of life and it barely weighed 10 pounds. "Ready," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. The drive to the estate took 40 minutes, moving out of the dense, claustrophobic city centre and into the sprawling, heavily wooded suburbs of the North Shore. The roads grew wider, the houses larger, hidden behind iron gates and high hedges. When the Lincoln finally turned off the main road, it didn't pull up to a mansion. It pulled up to a fortress. A 12-foot-high wrought-iron gate blocked a sweeping driveway. Flanking the gate were massive stone pillars topped not with decorative lions, but with subtle, high-resolution security cameras. 2 men in heavy tactical jackets stood inside the guardhouse. They recognized the Lincoln, and the heavy gates swung open smoothly. The Rossi estate was immense, a sprawling manor built of dark stone and slate. It looked less like a home and more like a stronghold built to withstand a siege. The grounds were meticulously kept, but there were no flowers, no decorative fountains, just wide, clear sightlines and heavy ancient oaks. The SUV pulled to a halt in front of heavy oak double doors. Gabriel stepped out first, adjusting his suit jacket. Tess followed, clutching a cheap duffel bag to her chest like a shield. "Dominic will show you to your room," Gabriel said, not looking back as he walked up the wide stone steps. "Wash up. Change into something clean. I expect you in the kitchen in 30 minutes to prepare my grandfather's lunch." He walked inside the heavy doors, shutting behind him with a final echoing thud. Tess stood on the driveway, the biting wind whipping her hair around her face. She felt incredibly small. "This way, Miss Morgan," Dominic prompted, gently gesturing toward a side entrance. Her room was on the first floor, down a long, thickly carpeted hallway. It was larger than her entire apartment. The bed was a massive 4-poster oak frame with heavy dark linens. There was a private bathroom, stocked with soaps that smelled like sandalwood and money. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. Tess threw her duffel bag onto a velvet armchair. She didn't unpack. She went into the bathroom, splashed cold water on her face, and stared at her reflection. She looked pale, her eyes wide and haunted. "You're making 3,000 a week," she whispered to her reflection, trying to force the cynical practical part of her brain to take over. "Just cook the food. Keep your head down. Don't look at the guns." 30 minutes later, she navigated the labyrinthine halls to the kitchen. It was a commercial-grade marvel of stainless steel, gleaming marble, and copper pots. It smelled faintly of rosemary and garlic. Gabriel was sitting at a massive butcher block island, a laptop open in front of him. He was typing rapidly, his brow furrowed. He didn't look up when she entered. Before Tess could ask what she was supposed to cook, a slow, shuffling sound echoed from the adjacent hallway. Leo walked in. He wasn't wearing the heavy tweed coat today. He wore loose, comfortable linen trousers and a thick, hand-knit cardigan. He looked smaller than he had in the diner, frail and slightly lost. His cloudy blue eyes scanned the massive kitchen, sliding over Gabriel entirely, before locking on to Tess. A slow, bright smile broke across his weathered face. "Ah!" Leo rasped, his gravelly voice filled with genuine relief. "There you are, my dear. I was beginning to worry. Carl is working you too hard. Did you save me a slice of the cherry pie?" Tess froze. She looked at Gabriel, expecting him to correct the old man. But Gabriel had stopped typing. He was watching his grandfather, a profound, heavy sadness momentarily softening the hard lines of his face. He looked at Tess, giving her a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Play along." Tess swallowed the lump in her throat. She wiped her hands on the clean white apron someone had left on the counter for her. She stepped forward, abandoning the terrifying reality of the Mafia boss and the hitmen, and slipped back into the only role she knew how to play. "I'm sorry, Leo," Tess said, forcing a warm, steady smile onto her face. "We're fresh out of cherry, but I can make you a hell of a grilled cheese if you've got a minute to sit." Leo chuckled a dry, papery sound. He shuffled toward the island and carefully climbed onto a heavy wooden stool. "A grilled cheese will do perfectly, Tess, and perhaps a cup of that awful black coffee." "Coming right up," Tess said. She turned toward the massive, intimidating stove, picking up a skillet. As she turned her back, she felt Gabriel's eyes on her. Heavy, assessing. She was no longer just a waitress in a greasy spoon. She had crossed the threshold. She was cooking for the devil's grandfather deep inside the fortress, and the iron gates had locked firmly behind her. November bled into December, and the sprawling stone estate became Tess's entire universe. The rhythm of her days was strange, a jarring mix of domestic banality and unspoken violence. She woke at 6. She made oatmeal with sliced almonds for Leo. She sorted his pills blue for the blood pressure, white for the memory, yellow for the joints. She learned how to coax him out of his darker moods when the dementia dragged him into paranoid terrors of rival bosses from the 70s. She played endless hands of gin rummy, deliberately losing by just enough points to keep him engaged. She was earning $3,000 a week to be a granddaughter to a ghost. The house itself was a silent character in their routine. It was heavily staffed, yet profoundly empty. Men like Dominic and Victor moved through the corridors with the silent efficiency of sharks, their suit jackets always bulging slightly at the hip. A team of housekeepers arrived at dawn and vanished by noon, never making eye contact, never speaking above a whisper. And then there was Gabriel. He was a shadow that fell over the house at irregular intervals. Sometimes he was gone for 3 days straight, leaving behind a tense, humming energy in the guards. Sometimes he sat at the head of the massive mahogany dining table, eating the simple dinners Tess cooked, roast chicken-baked ziti meatloaf, while reading legal briefs and shipping manifests. They barely spoke. Their interactions were transactional, a nod of thanks for the coffee, a brief inquiry about Leo's mood. But Tess caught him watching her. It wasn't the leering gaze of a man looking at an employee. It was the clinical heavy assessment of a predator trying to understand a new species in his territory. She didn't flinch from it anymore. The initial terror of the Mafia boss had dulled, replaced by a cynical familiarity. He put his pants on one leg at a time, just like the line cooks at Frankie's diner. He just happened to order hits before his morning espresso. One Tuesday evening, the first real snow of the season began to fall, dusting the security cameras on the perimeter wall. Tess was in the kitchen, scrubbing a cast-iron pan in the deep farmhouse sink. Leo had gone to bed an hour ago. The house was dead quiet. The heavy oak doors of the kitchen swung open. Gabriel walked in. He looked exhausted. The sharp lines of his suit were rumpled, his tie loosened, and his knuckles were bruised, the skin broken and smeared with dried blood. He walked straight to the liquor cabinet, poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass, and downed it in one fluid motion. Tess kept scrubbing. She didn't ask. In this house, you didn't ask about the blood. Gabriel leaned heavily against the marble island, watching her back. He ate well today. 2 bowls of stew, Tess said, not turning around. He thought I was his sister Rosa for about 20 minutes. We talked about a bakery in Little Italy. Then he snapped back. He watched the snow for a while. Thank you. The words were quiet, heavy with a fatigue that went straight to the bone. Tess finally turned off the faucet. She dried her hands on a towel and looked at him. He was rubbing his temples, his dark eyes shadowed. He looked entirely stripped of the terrifying aura he projected to the world. He just looked like a man carrying a weight that was slowly crushing his spine. There's leftover stew in the fridge. Tess said, her voice carefully neutral. I can heat it up. It takes 2 minutes. Gabriel dropped his hand, looking at her. I'm paying you to feed my grandfather, Tess. Not me. You're paying me to keep him alive, she countered, tossing the towel onto the counter. He won't stay alive long if his grandson drops dead of a heart attack at 32 because he lives on scotch and adrenaline. Sit down. It was an order, a command from a waitress to a king. Gabriel stared at her, the silence stretching taut. Then a slow, exhausted smirk touched the corner of his mouth. He pulled out a stool and sat. Tess heated the stew. She placed the steaming bowl in front of him, sliding a heavy silver spoon next to it. She didn't sit with him. She leaned against the counter, opposite the island arms crossed, maintaining the boundary. Gabriel ate mechanically at first, then with a sudden starving intensity. When he finished, he pushed the bowl away. "The men who shot up the diner," Gabriel said, staring at the empty bowl. "They won't be a problem anymore." Tess felt a cold prickle at the base of her neck. She looked at his bruised, bloody knuckles. She understood exactly what he meant. She didn't feel relief. She just felt a profound, heavy sadness. "Does it ever end?" she asked quietly. Gabriel looked up. His eyes were flat, deadened by the reality of his existence. "No. The ledger just gets passed to the next name in line. You balance it, or you bleed." He stood up, buttoning his ruined suit jacket. "Lock your door tonight, Tess. Sleep well." The alarm didn't wail. It was a silent, pulsing red strobe light that suddenly ignited in the corner of Tess's ceiling, painting the dark room in a frantic, bloody rhythm. It was 3 a.m., 3 days after the snowstorm. Tess was awake instantly. The cynical, hardened shell she had built over the last month cracked, letting the raw animal panic from the diner flood back in. She threw off the heavy duvet, her bare feet hitting the freezing hardwood floor. The house was completely silent, but it was a heavy, vibrating silence. She threw on a thick robe and opened her bedroom door. The hallway was dark, the emergency lights casting long, distorted shadows. A heavy hand clamped over her mouth before she could scream. "Quiet," Dominic hissed in her ear. He smelled of gun oil and cold sweat. He pulled his hand away but kept a tight grip on her bicep. In his other hand, a suppressed submachine gun gleamed dully in the red strobe light. "Perimeter is breached. South wall. We have hostiles on the grounds. Move. Leo." Tess gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Victor is moving him to the safe room," Dominic said, dragging her down the corridor toward the central staircase. "My orders are to get you there. Do not speak. Do not stop moving." They reached the top of the stairs. The massive foyer below was pitched in darkness. Suddenly the heavy oak front doors shuddered. A deafening, splintering crash echoed through the cavernous space as a battering ram hit the reinforced wood. The wood held, but the hinges groaned violently. "Backstairs," Dominic grunted, pivoting sharply. They ran. Down a narrow servants' corridor through the industrial laundry room. Tess's lungs burned. The estate, usually so sprawling and empty, suddenly felt like a shrinking cage. Pop, 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 pop. The muffled sound of suppressed gunfire echoed from the east wing. The fighting was inside the house. Dominic shoved her behind a heavy stone pillar in the basement corridor. He raised his weapon, aiming down the dark hallway. "Wait here. Do not move until I come back for you." He didn't wait for her to nod. He vanished into the gloom. Tess crouched against the cold stone, pulling her knees to her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was a waitress. She was supposed to be worrying about late rent and rude customers, not waiting to catch a stray bullet in a Mafia war. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. The distant pops of gunfire ceased, replaced by a suffocating quiet. Then footsteps, heavy, deliberate. They weren't Dominic's quick, tactical steps. They were slow. Limping, Tess pressed herself harder into the shadows, barely breathing. A silhouette rounded the corner. Broad shoulders, a ruined overcoat. Gabriel. He was holding a handgun loosely by his side. His left arm was pressed tight against his ribs, his hand slick with dark blood. He stopped, scanning the shadows. "Tess!" His voice was a harsh, ragged rasp. Tess scrambled out from behind the pillar. "Gabriel." He looked at her, his posture sagging slightly in relief. "You're untouched." "I'm fine. Where is Leo?" "Safe room, secure." Gabriel leaned heavily against the stone wall, sliding down slightly until he caught himself. He grimaced, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his teeth. Tess didn't think. The instinct to care, honed by weeks of managing a frail old man and years of serving exhausted strangers, overrode her fear. She closed the distance between them, grabbing his right arm to steady him. "You're shot," she said, her hands already moving to unbutton the ruined, blood-soaked fabric of his coat. Through and through, Gabriel grunted his head, falling back against the stone. "Missed the lung. Moroni's men. A desperate play. It failed. You need a doctor," Tess said, applying pressure to the wound with the thick fabric of her robe. Her hands were stained red instantly. It was warm and sticky. Gabriel looked down at her. In the dim emergency lighting, his dark eyes were stripped of all their usual armor. There was no arrogance, no calculation, just a man bleeding out in a basement. "The doctor is on his way," Gabriel whispered. He lifted his uninjured hand, his blood-stained fingers weakly gripping her wrist. "You didn't run." "Where would I go, Gabriel?" Tess asked, a bitter, cynical laugh escaping her lips. "You bought my world. I just live in it now." He closed his eyes. "I will balance the ledger, Tess. I swear it. Just stay awake," she ordered, pressing harder on the wound. "Keep your eyes open. That's an order." He obeyed. The aftermath of violence was meticulously mundane. By dawn, the blood was bleached from the hardwood floors. The splintered front doors were replaced by a temporary steel bulkhead. The bodies men Tess never saw but knew were removed with quiet, terrifying efficiency. Tess sat at the massive kitchen island, staring at a mug of cold black coffee. Her hands were clean, scrubbed raw with a wire brush and harsh soap, but she could still feel the phantom warmth of Gabriel's blood on her palms. Leo was asleep in his room, completely unaware of the siege sedated by the estate's on-call physician. The kitchen doors opened. Gabriel walked in. He looked like a ghost. He wore a simple grey t-shirt and loose sweatpants. His left side was heavily bandaged, visible through the thin cotton. He moved stiffly, his usual terrifying grace replaced by a guarded, painful shuffle. He didn't go to the liquor cabinet. He walked to the island and sat on the stool next to Tess. They sat in silence for a long time. The morning sun crept through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes, dancing in the sterile kitchen air. "The Moroni family is headless," Gabriel said quietly, breaking the quiet. His voice was flat, carrying no triumph. "My men hit their compound an hour ago. Retaliation for the breach. The war is over. The local factions will fall in line." Tess kept her eyes on her mug. "So the ledger is balanced." "It is." Gabriel shifted slightly, wincing. He placed a familiar, thick manila envelope on the butcher block between them. 50,000. And a car is waiting out front. Your apartment building is safe. You have your life back, Tess." Tess stared at the brown paper. 2 months ago, it was everything she wanted. It was an escape pod. She thought about her freezing, pathetic apartment. She thought about Carl sweating and screaming over ketchup bottles. She thought about the lonely, grinding poverty that waited for her outside the iron gates. Then she thought about Leo asking for his sister Rosa. She thought about the heavy, sad silence of this fortress. She looked at the brutal, bleeding man sitting next to her, who ruled a city but couldn't pour his own scotch without wincing. "I can't go back," Tess said. Her voice was steady, surprising her. Gabriel frowned, turning his head to look at her. "You are free to leave. The debt is paid." "It's not about the debt." Tess snapped, a flash of her old defiance returning. "It's about the reality. I go back there, I'm a waitress with 50 grand in a bank account that I have to explain to the IRS. I go back to a life that meant nothing. Here." She swallowed hard. "Here Leo needs me. and you're going to get yourself killed if someone doesn't remind you to eat. Gabriel stared at her, the mask completely slipping. For the first time since she met him, the Mafia boss looked genuinely shocked. You want to stay, he stated, trying to process the logic. In a house with bullet holes in the walls, I want 5,000 a week, Tess countered, looking him dead in the eye, fully embracing the cynicism of his world. I want full medical, I want weekends off, and I want you to stop tracking mud into my kitchen when you come back from murdering people. Gabriel looked at her for a long, heavy moment. The shock faded, replaced by a slow, rising respect. He saw her not as a liability, not as an employee, but as an equal. Someone who had looked into the abyss of his life and decided she could negotiate with it. He reached out and pulled the envelope back toward himself. Done, Gabriel said softly. Tess stood up. She took her cold coffee to the sink and poured it down the drain. She grabbed a clean apron from the hook and tied it around her waist. The fabric felt like armor. Good, she said, pulling a carton of eggs from the industrial refrigerator. Now sit still. I'm making you an omelette, and you're going to eat every damn bite. Gabriel leaned back against the counter, wincing as his bandages pulled, but a small, genuine smile finally broke through the hard lines of his face. He watched her work the tension in the room, shifting from dangerous to deeply, strangely domestic. The outside world belonged to the monsters, but inside the gates, the ledger was balanced. The coffee was hot, and Tess Morgan was exactly where she chose to be. If this story of unlikely loyalty and dangerous debts gripped you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more intense, grounded Mafia romance dramas. The tension between Tess and Gabriel proved that sometimes the most dangerous deals are the ones we choose to make. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload when we explore the dark, cynical, and emotional corners of the underworld. Subscribe and like for more stories.